There you are, John.
Here I am.
Good morning. Good morning to all of you, and a special welcome to my friend and colleague, Reverend John Buehrens. I'm so glad you're here, John. And we will have lunch together soon sometime, somewhere. So, but thank goodness for the mystery of Zoom, right? John was a big part of my discernment to ministry. We met when I was the president of SIECUS, the Sex Information and Education Council of the US, because John picked up the phone one day to call me. So John, do you remember that? Can you tell them what made you reach out to me at SIECUS?
Well, I actually visited you in your office in New York because Unitarian Universalists were justifiably proud of being pioneers in comprehensive sexuality education for young people. But by the early 1990s, when I was president, we needed to update our curriculum and go from a curriculum called All About Your Sexuality to one called Our Whole Lives. And I came to call on you because you helped set the standards for comprehensive sexuality education. And the curriculum that we developed as a result went on to be adopted not only by our denomination, but by many other religious groups, and to receive the imprimatur and the funding of the Ford Foundation. So it was a great triumph.
And I was actually thinking about the call, your panic call, when CBS called you.
Yeah, that actually was a bit later, Debra. And
okay.
the person who really
had already met.
Yeah, the person who really helped on that one was our mutual friend, Fred Garcia, who was a communications consultant for us.
Yeah. So Concord, Massachusetts, they had a little bit of an uproar about the slides that were part of that program. And maybe I was talking to Fred about that. So we're so proud to have you with us today. And I'd like to talk a little bit about your time as president of the UUA, because sure. That's an incredible accomplishment and time for us. You went there following your service as co-minister of All Souls in New York with Reverend Dr. Forrest Church. So when you think back from 20 years ago, but from this vantage point, what are you most proud of that you accomplished during your time?
Well, you know, one of the things Forrest and I did together was we co-authored a little book called A Chosen Faith, an introduction to Unitarian Universalism. And since there's that old principle that no good deed goes unpunished, I was recruited to run for the presidency of the association. The 1990s were a period when Unitarian Universalism was really expanding. And what I feel most proud of is that I put the accent on strengthening our programs for children and youth, starting more young adult programs and campus ministries. And I even had to invent a mortgage banking system for the denomination because so many of our congregations were building new buildings, and local banks don't often like to lend to congregations. So I went around, I helped to dedicate 166 new Unitarian Universalist church buildings. I visited over 600 of our congregations, including, I remember coming to Aptos, although not for a Sunday morning. I was in the Monterey area. And the hard part, of course, was that it was a fairly relentless job. I was working 90% of the time and on the road probably 2/3 of that time. So it was wearing, but I look back on it as a period of real accomplishment. We conducted 2 capital campaigns for the denomination that went over their goals and really helped to lay the groundwork for lean times, because those come as well.
Yeah. Well, we're certainly grateful to you. And you're also known because of your groundbreaking work on social justice. So HAL was redone on your watch. You and I've worked together on several pretty groundbreaking projects, I think. You were one of the people who came and helped me develop the Religious Declaration on Sexual Morality, Justice, and Healing, representing the UUA at that colloquium. And you were on the board of Freedom to Marry, where you also got me involved. So let's talk more generally about what roles have you played in the last 25 years in creating social justice movements?
Well, actually, one of the things that I was proud of during the time that I was president, I couldn't talk very much about. That was that we helped to create probably the deepest, broadest network of social activists in South Asia, in India.
Really?
Through the Holding Holding India program. We took an organization called the Self-Employed Women's Association from 6 members to 1,400,000 empowered women running a small bank and micro lending bank, not a small one, training people, the fighting against indentured labor, establishing a network of Dalits, the so-called untouchables of India, for their human rights. We've been involved in almost every interfaith international effort for cooperation, peace, and justice that I can think of. I was also honored to be serving as the honorary president of World Religions for Peace, which, although it too is a fairly quiet organization, a leadership organization, not a grassroots organization, does incredible work to call out people who use religion in destructive ways. Mm. And to ask people of every religious tradition to get back to the solid human to human core of their own spirituality.
Yeah. So important, right? So especially with people who are trying to abuse religion and work against justice in its name. Before we go on to your book, I want to talk just a little bit though about freedom to marry and your work, because to me, one of the most important things that we can be proud of, and I think you played a role, I think I played a role, right? Is that we really led that movement in the United States.
We did. And we won it really, faster, I think, than we expected.
Right?
Yeah, exactly. When I became national co-chair of Freedom to Marry, I was the only non-gay person in the room. And I said, I think we need to, GLBT people need to realize you have more straight allies than you know. And you were certainly part of helping to build that network, Debra. At one point, the foundations that were helping us said, you're so far ahead of our expectations that how would you like another $1 million? Right. I told Evan Wolfson, who was the executive director of Freedom to Marry, that it was the only justice cause that I'd ever been involved with where the money chased us.
You know, and if you think in the rapid part of that, when we did the declaration, we called for the recognition of same-sex unions in 1999, right? And here in 2015, the Supreme Court legalized marriage for everyone. So, you know, as a social movement, would that we did so well on reproductive justice, right? In these last.
Yep, but that of course has got its own complex religious and political dimensions.
So let's go back in time, as Jessica helped seat us. Your latest book is Conflagration. That's actually hard to say.
Conflagration.
Say it again.
Conflagration.
Conflagration.
So the book starts with the conflagration of the steamer Lexington in January of 1840, in which a abolitionist minister ended up dying at sea amid burning bales of cotton. It's quite a dramatic story. It's the death of Charles Follen, a German-born transcendentalist minister.
And so let's start at the beginning of the story. So I remember I learned about Emerson and Thoreau and Alcott in my high school English classes, but nobody ever mentioned that they were religious people or had anything to do with religion. Although they were brilliant writers, that really isn't their major contributions to America, is it?
No, I don't think it is. It's somewhat unfortunate that we encounter the transcendentalists in English classes rather than in history classes, because in many ways, as the subtitle of my book makes clear, they sparked the American struggle for racial, gender, and social justice. You have to include in them a couple of generations of Unitarians, But in the first generation, all transcendentalists were Unitarians. Not only Alcott and Thoreau and Emerson, although Thoreau was a bit of a disaffiliate. The bulk of the people that I treat in the book are the folks who were forgotten, who were leaders of that discussion group that Jessica alluded to, and who went on to do all sorts of things. I mean, James Freeman Clarke, who's the sort of the thread figure in my book, becomes the first professor of comparative religion in the United States, because one of the things the Transcendentalists did was open their minds and their souls to inspiration from religious traditions other than the biblical. They helped to spark the environmental movement. Certainly Thoreau and the connection to people like, well, our own John Muir out here in California was very strong. But the biggest contributions were around starting the women's rights movement. Margaret Fuller and her Conversations for Women, attended by Elizabeth Cady Stanton. The women are all too often forgotten, and the involvement of the Transcendentalists in the abolitionist movement was absolutely critical. Theodore Parker risked his life rescuing people from the slave catchers that came to Boston. He wrote his sermons with a loaded pistol on his desk so he could protect the fugitive slaves that were in his own house. He headed up the Committee on Vigilance, won the enduring friendship of Frederick Douglass in the process. But we forget these things. That's why I thought I needed to write a book that was about not what they wrote, but what they did.
So I love the story in the book, and I didn't know it, about how Frederick Douglass, honored his friend, the Reverend Theodore Parker. And, you know, Theodore Parker, I think, is such an unsung hero, right? We've all learned to say the arc of the universe bends towards justice. We think we're quoting Martin Luther King when we're quoting Theodore Parker. So tell the story of what Frederick Douglass did for Theodore Parker's memory.
Oh, this is later in Douglass's life. The year is 1887. He's the most famous African-American on the planet. He's touring Europe, and he arranges to travel overnight on the train from Rome to Florence, which is the place where Theodore Parker died. Parker, like many people of that era, had tuberculosis. And the prescription of the time was take a sea voyage and go to a warmer climate. So he died when he had reached Italy. Douglass goes to Florence to put flowers on Theodore Parker's grave. It was a very modest little plaque in the Protestant cemetery in Florence. And he writes that night to Elizabeth Cady Stanton's son, a man like that should have a monument that is a sermon in itself.
I love that.
And he goes back to Rome and commissions the monument that stands on Theodore Parker's grave to this day, and which is inscribed, his name is here incised in marble, his legacy on the hearts of those whom he saved from slavery and superstition. To do that 27 years after Parker died is an index of how deep that spiritual friendship really was. And that was one of the key concepts of the Transcendentalists. Spiritual friendships that transcended differences in social position, gender, theology, even race, which was probably the most difficult barrier to cross both then and now. I offer quite a number of examples of that. I mentioned James Freeman Clarke. He was the lifelong close friend and correspondent of Margaret Fuller. And when she died tragically at the age of 40, returning from Italy with her baby and her baby's father, it was James Freeman Clarke, along with Emerson and Thoreau and William Henry Channing, who kind of made sure that Margaret's legacy was not forgotten. The book about her that they brought into print, the memoir of Margaret Fuller Ossoli, was the most a widely read book in America for 2 years, from until it was sort of swamped by another book called Uncle Tom's Cabin.
Right. So, John, I think a lot of us think of ourselves as transcendentalists. I mean,
Sure.
we certainly, when I talk to people who are new to our movement about our religion, and they find out that they're very excited because so many of them are interested in nature and their own way of understanding the divine. What happened to them? Why don't we have this movement now?
So part of it goes back to the question that the term was almost seized by the English professors. And applied only to the people who were writers before and during and a little bit after the Civil War. But in fact, the Transcendentalist movement helps to spawn interfaith cooperation, the World Parliament of Religions. It helps to spawn things like the American Civil Liberties Union, which was founded by Unitarians. It helps to spawn the environmental movement, with people like Muir and the Sierra Club picking up Thoreau's own phrase, "In wildness is the preservation of the world." So the Transcendentalist movement, properly understood, never went away. It just like a river spread out into a delta with many branches. Even today, I would say that almost everybody who is not just a narrow sectarian and who is involved in the environmental and human rights movements is in some way an indebted continuer of the Transcendentalist movement. They just don't know it. And that was another.
I want to pick up on just don't know it for a sec, because that's actually our problem overall as Unitarian Universalists, right? That we know that so many people believe, as we do, in freedom of religion and the use of democracy and the dignity and worth of all people, in not having a creedal religion, but that our faith is in our actions and our deeds. And yet our movement's actually smaller, much smaller than it was than the period you wrote about in the book. And we really haven't grown since 1960. So
no, I don't want.
I'd love to know. Where do you think we're going?
I would contradict you there
okay.
a bit, Deborah, because at the time of the Transcendentalist movement, there were fewer than 100 Unitarian churches.
Oh, okay. Oh, so it got bigger later.
There are now over 1,000. So but what is striking is that our movement had its deepest and widest influence in the 19th century in the run-up to Civil War and during the Civil War. During the Civil War, there were 8 Unitarians in the US Senate. The vice president was a Unitarian. Lincoln would occasionally go to Unitarian services in Washington. Out here in Star Kings, California, he was raising the money that really saved the Union cause during the Civil War. So and then in the 20th century, by my analysis, we reached our maximum influence during the 1960s with the civil rights movement and the protests against the war in Vietnam. And by the way, also with the rise of a second phase of American feminism. But
we're not growing right now. I mean, we're not hemorrhaging like some of the other denominations. But we're, in your vision, where are we going? Where do you think we're going? What are our biggest challenges?
Well, I just finished writing another book called A Religious Center with a Civic Circumference, Unitarians in San Francisco since 1850. And it's more than the story of an influential congregation. It was the most influential congregation in the whole state during Star King's time. But it's had its ups and downs. I mean, at the end of World War II, attendance at the church here in San Francisco was down to about 35 people on a Sunday.
Wow.
There only had about 125 members left. This in a congregation but then, by 1967, the congregation had grown to over 1,000 members. So one of the things we have to accept is that history, like culture, has its waves. And one of the strange things about when we prosper is when times are really toughest.
Oh, we got those now.
We do indeed. I think the hard part today, however, is that America has become a very secular individualist culture, a consumerist culture. It used to be that, as one of our own historians put it, America was the nation with the soul of a church. And everybody felt that they wanted to find a religious home. Today, you hear people saying, well, I'm spiritual, but I'm not religious. I'm not going to involve myself with a community, even the most liberal community. And that, I believe, is because from the 1980s on, outfits like the Christian Coalition and the Moral Majority, which was never either, pretended to represent all of American religion, and they did it in the name of conservative dogmatism and frankly, things that were regressive in terms of rights for women and certainly homophobic. So religion got a bad name. And that we have to combat as best we can. And I think one of the ways we can do that is by telling our friends and prospective members, this is a pluralistic approach to religion. It's one where your authentic spirituality will be respected, where you won't have to park your brain at the door, and where you will find yourself in reconnection, which is what religion means in its root, in reconnection.
So John, we're going to wrap up, but let me ask you one last question.
Sure.
What's exciting you today? Where's your ministry taking you now?
Well, I keep writing. As I say, I've just finished this book. And in the course of doing it, I discovered that there are a couple of things that Thomas Starr King did during his brief 4-year ministry here that he doesn't get any credit for. For one thing, he was the person who started the movement to save Yosemite Valley. He went up there within his first 3 months of being out here in California and saw its splendors and got Carlton Watkins, the pioneer landscape photographer of the West, to go up and make photographs. By the way, 10 of them ended up in the possession of Ralph Waldo Emerson. Wow. 2 of them still hang in the Emerson House in Concord. They circulated with very influential people. And as I said, during the Civil War, that's when the US government set aside Yosemite as a park controlled by California then, in perpetuity for its beauty. And so the next thing I'm going to be doing is working with a fellow who is a biographer of Carlton Watkins, the photographer, and we're going to co-edit the works of Thomas Starr King, which have never been published, but he's the first Western transcendentalist. And his sermons, oh my heavens, Yosemites of the soul, the living waters of Lake Tahoe, the high ground of the Sierras. It's a moral high ground he's talking about. These need to be appreciated for the brilliant writing and insight that they are. And so that's what keeps me sitting at my desk with all these books behind me, still working away. I think in my 50 years as a minister, I have been as much an adult religious educator as a pastor and an administrator. And so that's the part of my ministry that I'm really emphasizing these days. And that's why I want to invite people to these 4 sessions I'm doing on the Transcendentalists that will take place in the month of January, starting January 9th at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Pacific time. There'll probably be a couple of hundred people involved. This one is being organized by a church in New York, and but the information about it and they'll hear it at 7 o'clock that evening. But it'll be some lecture, but mostly discussion of this transcendentalist heritage.
Great. Well, I look forward to hoping to join into some of them, and I will promise all of you, I will get the information out to you. So John, thank you so much. I wish we could have done it in person, but you are such a treasure, and we are so grateful that you were with us today.
Thank you, Debra. And I want to congratulate the congregation on giving my good friend Russ Mank a well-deserved sabbatical and finding such a remarkable and brilliant person to step in his stead. Take care, Debra. All the best.
Thanks, John. All right, time for the